Welcome. So this is a review of the midterm exam. Now, in this particular lecture, we're only going to be talking about the essay exam. I have another lecture where I'll be talking about the more objective 2-point questions that you also took as the first part of this exam. But this is about the essay exam. And this is kind of a graph of how the exam was scored, with 0 being the lowest and 9 being the highest. What we have is we have a bell curve here, a really nice bell curve, that is a little bit weighted to the bottom end down here. And we'd like to see this area move, more to that middle end. That would make me feel a lot better. But, this is also right about kind of what we're expecting at the midterm. And I'll kind of go over that with you here as we go through. But this is for all of the students who took the exam. That is the students in both the online class and the face-to-face class. And this is what it looks like if you break those out and look at them just in terms of separate the online class from the face-to-face class. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because even maybe it is more or less important to you, but it is really important to me that I'm giving the same kind of quality of instructions and that I'm holding students in my online classes and my face-to-face classes to the same standards. Because, while there are certain challenges and benefits to any format, I want those to come from you, not from the quality of the instruction. So, although it may not seem like it, I am trying to be a good teacher. And what you'll notice here, and this is a good thing, I think, is that, these things vary together, right? The reason why the orange bars are always higher really is because there are almost more than twice as many students in the face-to-face class than there are in the online class. Something like 48 to 20, I think, are the numbers. And so in terms of looking at that, we would expect that the orange bar would be higher in most cases. But it's that they vary together, where they go down, they both go down, where the total goes down, and it seems to be roughly commensurate, perhaps with a little bit of a gap here in the 3 range, which would be the equivalent of hitting about a 1 on all 3 of the questions. Okay, so the point of that was just to show you that I kind of really do think that kind of in terms of that, I'm feeling pretty good about that. I haven't always felt that comfortable about the quality of instruction, the difference between the instructions, because we're all trying to get better at what we do. So anyway, all right. Now, before I go on and talk about how the essays were scored, I do want to draw a really clear distinction for you here. I'm not really talking about grading, and I can just sum up the grading criteria here pretty much as follows. The lowest score of people who took the exam, that is that they made an effort to take the exam, they tried, they got a 0 out of 15. That is that their scores were 0, 0, 0 out of 3 essays. Those students received Ds, and that wasn't even like a D minus. It's a low D, but it's a passing grade. The highest score was a 9 out of 15, and that score received an A+, so 25 out of 25. And that was what I then took. That was my range, and I kind of filled it in based on that, kind of marking out as we counted up from 1 then to 9. This is what a 1 would get based on that scale. This is what an 8 would get. This is then what a 2 would get, what a 7 would get, what a 6, what a 5, what a 4, what a 3, right? And there we go, and that's how we built the grades. But this lecture is not about grading, okay? This lecture is about scoring, because the scoring part is essential, and we're going to be talking about this especially a lot in our last unit of the semester, Unit 4, because scoring and grading are not the same thing. All right, scoring, what we're talking about is an objective measurement on an objective scale that measures argumentation literacy. Now, just so you know, this is a scale that myself and several graduate students and some undergraduate students that we've been working on developing this scale over the course of about the last year, trying to see if we can't set up a really, fair, even measure that kind of tests argumentation literacy. And we're working that out as an effort to see whether or not y'all are getting the same level of instruction in the face-to-face as you are in the online class. So, let me walk you through that scale. It's built on a 0 to 5 point scale, right, or 0 to 5 point measure. So that's 6 points that you have on the scale that separate the lowest possible score, 0, from the highest possible score, 5. And each of those scores measures essentially a certain level of what we would call attainment of argumentation literacy, kind of where you rank. Now, The idea is that, of course, the more experienced, the more training, the more education that you've had in argument, the higher we would expect you to be on the scale. So there's no reason to expect that as a college junior or senior, perhaps even as a college sophomore, that you would be getting a 5 on that scale. That's just simply, that would suggest a much more advanced than we would expect of someone in a 300 level course, right? So our measure is 3, okay? That's you. You're 3. You are in this is a coincidence in terms of numbers, I promise you, a 300 level course in argumentation, okay? A student who completes this course should be scoring approximately a 3, okay? So, now that said, if you're a 3, okay, then what does a 2 mean? Well, a 2 would be then obviously, intuitively, less than a 3. So I would expect maybe somebody who walked in this door, who had, courses like maybe public speaking and composition, writing courses, who maybe taken some courses in high school, right? Basic undergraduate level stuff, right? Those would be at my kind of high end for a 2, although I don't think at my low end, I'm too much of a risk of saying that my low end would be, high school students, perhaps AP students, high school graduates. I mean, kind of depending on a lot of things, it would not be outside the realm of my expectations to see them falling in that scale too. And so that kind of sets sort of my low end to my high end, right? If we laid out in grades, it might be considered, grades 11, 12, 13, and 14, would fit inside that sort of grade scale. Your sort of junior, senior in high school to your freshman, sophomore in college. A 1 is a clear weakness. A 1 is then below that. That means that you're doing less than I would expect of a high school junior in that level of case, right? That means that there is something really quite wrong with that argument, okay? And there needs to be a higher level of kind of approachment to that argument, right? That's where we're kind of aiming at, is how do we get, what do we overcome? What's the problem here? And I can talk to you about what those problems are as we go through and talk about the specific questions in this exam. 0 means there's some widespread problems. Okay, there's a serious problem somewhere. It might also mean that, there's deficiencies in 2 areas, right? And part of the problem is that when you have kind of multiple criteria, multiple standards, multiple things you're looking for in a given area, if you miss 1 or 2, but man, you miss a 3rd one even a little bit, and by that point the whole analysis just really collapses in on itself. So this is more of a either major error or a kind of collision of multiple smaller errors. But there's serious deficiencies in the argument on some level. And that means that a 5 and 4, right, that those are what we would assume of an advanced understanding, right? This is something that I would expect, for example, of my graduate students. I would definitely expect it of my graduate students who are assisting me in a course like this, that they would be able to score a 4 or a 5 with simply no problem. A 5 would be on the scale of kind of the highest level that you could possibly get and really still be considered acting as a student in any way, as having to demonstrate that knowledge. By the time you're hitting a 5, you're actually generating and developing new argumentative theory, not just analyzing and interpreting arguments. So we're talking about kind of what I would expect of, say, a doctoral student at the 500 level. So in that sense, we might also expect to see people who'd had some other kind of specialized training also hitting at that level of a 4 or 5. So if you were on your high school or college debate team and you had done a lot of debating, your terminology may not be the same as used in traditional kinds of argumentative analysis, right? You and I may be using different words. I may say conclusion, you may say resolution, for example. But when it comes down to it, that level of understanding should be able to come through, for somebody who has some kind of serious specialized training in argumentation. And so, although these things are not outside the realm of possibility, I can tell you that I have on these exams before given 4s and 5s. I did not give any 4s or 5s at all on this particular midterm, and I've given only a handful of them the entire time I've been implementing this particular method of scoring. So I just want you to know that. But it's definitely something that on the final exam I expect to see, at least a few more of those showing up. This is where I expect the midterm to be. This is kind of where I want, this is my expectation of kind of like if you were scoring, mostly ones on your 3 questions, if you were scoring mostly 2s on your 3 questions, then you should be getting a pretty good score on this exam. You're getting a B on the exam. Now, if you were actually scoring 3s and 4s, you probably were getting an A on the exam. There were no 4s. But if you were scoring a couple of 3s in there, yeah, then you probably have an A on this exam based on kind of how those things chart out. There were zeros, right? Okay, there were zeros. In most cases, however, the things that brought up zeros had more to do with kind of exam taking skills than I think they actually represent deficiencies in your understanding of the issues or concerns. Although in some areas, and with at least some answers, I think that you do need to go and think about how much preparation you're doing for these exams, because that's where we're going to be at in a 0. Okay, so there's 2 possibilities if you were scoring zeros. There are that, you think you've got this stuff figured out, or at least you're starting to get it figured out, but you really just swung and missed at the question. You kind of missed something that I was looking for in that question, and that's kind of what happened, and that happens a lot. There are a lot of really well-written essays, really well-written responses that still got zeros because they just were way off the mark in terms of what they were talking about. Now, that said, there are also people who got zeros because they just really were kind of unclear, I think, on what some of the key concepts in argumentation are. So there's no mistake, okay? If you got a 0, there was a problem with your answer, all right? I don't necessarily know what that problem is, and I'm happy to work with you individually on that. But in all likelihood, in the comments, it probably told you, kind of sort of why you got that. All right, so as you go through and look at your essay, look at those comments, and they're often very short, they're very clipped, they're intended to be very fast and direct. Part of the idea of how we want to use a scale is that it should be able to move us through relatively quickly. But by the time we get to the final and kind of where I expect to see the scores ranging on the final, I expect to see my B students, the students who are going to end up getting Bs on that final, on that part of the final exam, they're going to be pulling, 2s on maybe 2 out of 3 of those questions minimum, right? Okay, mostly 2s, maybe a 3 and a couple 1s might be able to pull you up into that B range. But certainly A students are going to be scoring a minimum of 3 in all or most of those questions. Now, again, this is a curved exam, so it's based a lot on how you do on the exam, okay? That's a really big part of it. It's about how you do on the exam that kind of sets those limits. It's not me. Although I am more than happy to give everybody A's. Don't worry, I don't curve it to force F's, right? That's not going to happen. But first thing, So the first question on the exam is, what is your tech ID? And actually a surprising number of you got this wrong. That did complicate things. It made things very difficult to score and very difficult to grade. You're going through and trying to line up tech IDs. And, if one person gets it wrong, it's pretty easy to figure out who it was. When 4 people get it wrong, it creates a little bit of a hassle. So that is important that you double check those things and that you answer that question correctly when it comes up again, because that's a pretty crucial one. That said, let's move on to the actual questions that were scored. We didn't score question 1, thank goodness. We did start scoring the next question, okay? And this question was a description question. And I think that's really the key thing that I want you to hone in on here. There are 3 main things that we're going to be looking for whenever we're doing an exam like this. The first of those is going to be description. And that is, we want you to describe the argument. Now, when I'm describing the argument, I'm going to go through it. A lot of you really honed in on the introductory material. I think there's this sort of built-in expectation that whatever the thesis of my argument is, it's going to be in the opening paragraph. And that is very true when we are working on being writers ourselves. When you're looking at something like this, though, this is an excerpt from a much larger interview. And when Chomsky starts talking about his argument, right up here, okay, there's a little bit of a kind of setting up the scenario for you so you sort of know what's going on. What I always encourage people to do is, before you start saying this is what the article or this is what the argument is about, read the whole thing. Read the whole thing, write some notes down, highlight if you have that option or ability, get a kind of sense of the entire thing that you're reading, and then step back and ask yourself what's going on here. Don't try to figure everything out, and certainly don't come to the conclusion that you've got it all figured out in the first paragraph. And I think a number of you sort of got really hung up on that part, which is not to say that you didn't produce a very good interpretation, but I think the strongest interpretations were those who kind of looked at it in a different way. And I'm going to show you kind of the way that this might be broken down and one way that I would analyze it. But that's one thing that a lot of you could do to work on your analysis. If you look at the rest of the essay, it's not really so much about Chomsky saying, hey, you know, a lot of people are capable of doing this kind of analysis. In fact, the bulk of his argument, the other 3 paragraphs, are all about the intelligentsia and about what he feels and thinks about the intelligentsia. So if I was going to say this article is about doing analysis, okay, that's not an unreasonable interpretation. And I think that that's where most of you kind of gravitated to, that Chomsky's argument was about the ins and outs of who can and who cannot do analysis. And that's very good, and I think a lot of you structured that. Okay, and a lot of you were even able to pull 3s out of doing that kind of level of analysis because you were really able to back up your analysis, you were able to explain your points, and most importantly, you did the number 1 thing, which is that you demonstrated that you understood and got arguments, right? Because remember, this is an assessment exam, right? Okay, it's not about Chomsky, it's about you telling me that you get argument, right? So I look at this and I say, hey, I think that this is about the intelligentsia, and this is about what Chomsky thinks about the intelligentsia, right? And so that's going to be my subject term, the intelligentsia, okay? Now, because I know how claims are structured, all right, I know what's going to come next, and what comes next is a copular verb, right? Is, okay? Is. So now I know it. Now, Chomsky is very clearly opposed to the intelligentsia. He is not on their side. It seems quite evident that he does not like them. Okay, so there we go. The intelligentsia, what he's talking about, is bad, right? Okay, we should actually say here, not the intelligentsia is bad. You have to forgive me for my error there. This should be all intelligentsia is bad, right? And that gives us a clear quantity. It gives us a clear quality, right? It gives us a very sensible, kind of clear claim. And if we wanted to, we could test this on the square of opposition. But right? I want to go through and figure out his argument now. Now, I can't begin to break down his argument until I know what his claim is, right? That the intelligentsia is bad. Simple but clear, all right? So now I ask myself, okay, all right, Noam Chomsky, why? Why is the intelligentsia bad, right? And okay, first thing I've got here is look, here he defines who the intelligentsia is. Now, I'm going to point that out, I think, is an important part of the argument, and that helps me figure out and helps me get a sense of who the hell Chomsky is talking about, right? What does he mean by the intelligentsia? He means the people that filter information from where it happens to how it gets to us, right? That might be information from a long time ago, so we might be talking about a historian. It might be from the immediate present, so we might be talking about news media, right? It might be about technical subjects, so we might be talking about teachers, right? It might be talking about legal processes, so we might be talking about lawyers or judges, right? He's talking about the intelligentsia very, very broadly. Okay, that's who he's talking about. Now I want to start describing this argument, right? How does Chomsky say these people, this list of people that he gives me, right? He thinks that they are bad, okay? As a class, as a group, they are bad. Okay, so how does he go about doing this? And this is where most of you ended up getting 1s. Okay, if you got a 1 on the first essay question on the exam, in all likelihood what your answer was just a summary of the argument. You went through from beginning to end and you took what Chomsky said and put it into your own words. Well, that shows a certain level of reading comprehension. Okay, you're able to take what someone else said and show that you actually can comprehend what it is that they said. Now that's fantastic, okay, but it is not the analysis of argument. Okay, your goal here, Your goal when you are describing an argument is to show your evaluator, to show me, right, that you understand arguments, right? It's not even that you understand Noam Chomsky. It's that you understand arguments, right? So once you've identified the claim, now break down how he gets to that claim. Okay, and in this sense, right, what you need to do is kind of really keep it simple and use what you know about arguments to kind of fill in the analysis and kind of take a guess at what the blanks are. You're kind of stripping away kind of a lot of the stuff and getting at sort of the bare bones, what a theorist named Parson calls the argument, if you will, right? So I start with the claim, right? Okay, and as you go through and you look at, okay, what is the intelligentsia? What do they do? What is their function? What is their purpose? What are they doing? And Chomsky's pretty clear about that. He said their goal is not to tell us what is going on, but to justify what is going on. Okay, all right, so the work of the intelligentsia is to justify social conditions, right? And then he says, okay, well, all right, well, clearly, if the intelligentsia are bad, right, and if their work is to justify the social conditions, and it only stands to reason that justifying the social conditions is bad, right, that completes my categorical syllogism. Right? Okay, and look at how I can just use that understanding of a categorical syllogism to sort of fill those blanks in, right? To kind of put that argument together. Okay, the work of the intelligentsia is to justify certain social conditions. Justifying the social conditions is bad. Okay, and we can compare that with actually explaining those social conditions. Okay, and now then my conclusion, the work of the intelligentsia is bad, which gets me to my conclusion, which gets me to the whole thesis of the essay right there, that they are bad, that all intelligentsia is bad. Why? Because their work is to justify the existence of certain inequalities, certain oppressions, certain exploitations in the system, and because they're doing that, they're bad, right? Okay, there you go. Therein lies his argument. It's built around the categorical syllogism. You know, another way that I might break it down, because there's no like one right way to break it down. All of these things that we're learning in class are just tools that we can use to analyze it. You know, and I was really kind of troubled here that I had to have this in there, right? That was necessary to squeeze into my argument. So maybe an even better way of breaking this down would be to use a disjunctive syllogism, all right? Which is to say, hey, he goes through this, he says either they're necessary, right? Either they're performing a necessary function of explaining to the general public what's going on so that we can make good decisions. They're either performing a necessary function or they are performing a bad function, right? Okay, and then Chomsky goes about proving that his opinion that they are not necessary, and if they are not necessary, they are by definition bad, right? Okay, see, there is how we go about breaking down the argument. We're not trying to capture the whole thing, right? And that's what I think a lot of you were doing, and some of you did a really excellent job of, is going through and trying to encapsulate the entire argument, often with really wonderful economy, sometimes with real insights of clarity, but you weren't getting at the underlying structure of the argument itself. Don't try to capture the whole thing. Just kind of look at the bare bones. Chomsky actually makes several different sub-arguments and supporting claims. I could break this down and go into a lot more detail about it, but I don't need to do that to show you that I understand arguments, right? I only need to get at this underlying structure and show how by using my knowledge of a disjunctive syllogism, I can show you how his argument works. A lot of you did some really cool stuff in here talking about testimony. Some of you talked about expertise. I think there were some of you who made some really great insights into the fact that Chomsky is basically saying, take my word for it, I'm an expert, you don't need to be an expert. I thought that was really, very smart. A lot of you were very, very insightful on a lot of things. And a lot of things that you did in these answers showed me that you understood certain dimensions of argument to a level where you were getting, twos, even if necessarily your interpretation wasn't spot on the way that I interpret it. There are different ways to interpret the argument. There are different ways to analyze the argument, all of which, give us some insights, right? Okay, the better your interpretation or analysis doesn't mean it lines up necessarily with mine. I want you to look at kind of how I did what I did, not necessarily feeling like you have to get to the exact same place that I got to in order to have a really good answer. That takes us to the second question. And the second question differs from the first question because the first question just wanted us to describe the argument. Just wanted us to say, okay, this is what I see happening here. This is how I'm going to make sense out of what's happening using theories of argument. In this question, we're evaluating arguments. That means that we're not just going to describe them. We're going to take the next step, which is to describe them and then to evaluate those arguments. And remember, most of our modes of description, most of the ways that we use to differentiate between types of arguments, have associated criteria or standards for evaluating arguments built into them. And we can use one way of breaking this question down and evaluating it in order to kind of see how that works. So first, right? Evaluation has to begin with identifying what the claim is. If you don't know what the claim is, then you don't know what it is that you're evaluating. And we're evaluating the argument. That is, we have to know what the reasons are, right? If we don't know what the reasons, the evidence, the logic, the assumptions, if we don't know what those are, then we have no basis for asking ourselves whether or not the argument works or not, whether or not it's sound. So these things have to come first, and only then can we move on to the actual work of evaluation. Where a lot of you fell short, where a lot of you scored zeros on this question, actually, is that you never got to step 3. You maybe did some work up here in step 2, and some people did some really good work in step 2. But if all you did was describe the argument and not actually evaluate the argument, you didn't really answer the question, and that got you a 0. So that's something you really need to keep in mind. Now, that means we want to start by identifying the claim. All right, what is the claim being made here, right? Okay, and I'm using a couple of clues from up here up top. The title of the book is one of the places that I'm going to go to. I know that he's interested in religious institutions, right? Okay, very good. So this is about churches maybe, and it's about complicity in the Holocaust. And then it seems like, wow, this last sentence really, I think, captures to me the idea of what this article, what this argument, is actually about. Now, again, I'm not going to try and base my interpretation on just what I read up here. I'm going to read the entire thing, right? And this is what my attention is cued to in terms of figuring out what this argument is actually about. So, I'm going to word my claim. Now, again, like with description, I'm not going to spend as much time on it, but like with the description, I'm paying attention to things like the quantity and quality. I'm paying attention to things like whether or not there's a copular verb. I've got a clear subject term. I've got a clear predicate term. Right now, I want to be careful here. I'm evaluating the argument. So this is where this distinction between all and maybe some is actually a really important distinction. So if I say he means all churches, am I going to pull that as my standard for evaluation? Look, if even one church somewhere disagrees, then Erickson's argument is completely wrong. Well, I think that may be part of the world where pure logic differs a little bit from the actual real lived experience of argumentation. We want to be worried that we don't fall into the world of sophistry, right? Okay, a straw argument, sometimes called a straw man, sometimes called a straw person, but I think the point here is what it's made out of, not the it. In this case, it's the argument that is made out of straw, which is to say it's intentionally weak. If we say by the all churches so that we can then knock it down by pointing out the one exception to that rule, then I would say that we're setting up a deliberately weak version of the argument. But the same thing goes true if we set up a deliberately low threshold for us to go after, right? If we by some German churches were complicit in the Holocaust, if we think we've met our standard, if we show even one church was complicit in the Holocaust, well then again, that feels a little bit more like a debater's trick, a sophism, than an actual argument, and that's what we mean by a straw argument. So I think in terms of where Erickson was trying to get at was he meant the churches generally. So he meant all. If we were to translate him into pure logic, it would be all. So generally speaking. So that is to say, I think while Erickson might admit the possibility of some exceptions to the rule, he means as a whole, as a group, as a class, the churches were complicit in the Holocaust. And I think that's a reasonable interpretation. Notice I've got my copula there. This is just the past tense of the word are. That complicit in the Holocaust in this case is just a fancy way of saying bad, right? All German churches were bad. Okay, so there you go. And here was a sticking point, I think. I think that for some of you, if you really, like, if the word complicit is one that's in your vocabulary, you know, your interpretations tended to be a lot stronger than people who kind of struggled with the true sense of what this meant. You know, a lot of times I saw arguments where people said the German churches made people participate, the German churches forced people to participate, the German churches, and that's really not what Erickson's argument was. He means complicity. Complicity means maybe you didn't fully actively participate, but you helped it along, you helped make it happen, sometimes even by your inactions. So, and in fact, actually, one of the things about the argument, one of the things Erickson does, is he actually leaves this claim as an assumption. This is something that you can pull from the text, you can kind of dig it out. You can figure out this is kind of what he means, helps to really have a clear sense of what the word complicit means, and then it's a little bit easier to put this together. But it's one of those unspoken or enthymematic claims. It's imperative to understanding his argument. If you didn't insert this, if you didn't fill this in yourself, then the argument probably didn't make a whole lot of sense to you. If you did this, if you shared this assumption, if you understand that this is what people mean when they say complicity, they mean you knew but you didn't do the right thing, you continue to act as though everything was okay, well, that's what complicity means. And if you got that, your interpretation was stronger, and if your interpretation was stronger, it was a lot easier to fit the analysis together. Now, there were some people who quite didn't make this jump, who didn't fill that leap in, who still did really good jobs of interpreting the argument. There's not any one perfect interpretation, but this kind of clicks it together in a way that helps it make sense. So figuring out what the author assumes. And notice, I didn't just guess. I knew what shape puzzle piece to look for, right, as I was going through there. I used what I knew about logical syllogisms to try to piece these arguments together and figure it out. And when I found something that seemed to make a lot of sense, click, there we go, that is the underlying premise, the thing that makes this work. I put it in a structure with an antecedent and consequent, and there go, it makes sense to me. Now, one thing here that helps is that the way I approach this, I looked at it as having not one, but two antecedent conditions. So this is a complicated argument, what we would call a compound argument. In this case, it's not if x then y, it's if x and y then z, right? And so this is a slightly different form, a variation. We're expanding upon what we know about hypothetical syllogisms in an effort to understand what's going on here. Now, that's the kind of leap, that kind of like figuring out and being like, oh, I'm going to extend, I'm going to elaborate on, I'm going to play with some of these theories in order to interpret what's going on. That's one of the things I want to encourage you to do. Theories are your tools. You can't figure out how to use tools unless you mess around with them. You know, in order to learn a hammer, you got to bang on some stuff, right? So that's how we learn how to break these arguments down. We got to play with them. We got to learn how to use them, not be used by them, right? So, okay, if this is the premise, right, this is the premise, the major premise of a hypothetical syllogism, then what are the minor premises? We know what he has to prove, right? The first thing Erickson's going to have to prove, if this is going to be anything like a decent argument, is he's going to have to prove that they, in fact, knew about the atrocities, right? Okay, if my argument, if there's smoke, then there's fire, right? In order to win and prove that argument, I'm going to have to prove there's smoke. Okay, so show me, Erickson, where's the smoke? Where's the knowledge of the atrocities? And there he has it, there in the first paragraph. That's what this is doing there, right? And what is this? We know that this is testimony. This is an eyewitness account. He even calls it an eyewitness account, I think, right? Telling us this is what happened in Germany at that time, and everybody knew what was going on. Great. Now, this is where description ends and evaluation starts kicking in, right? Okay, what makes testimony good versus testimony bad? How do we separate that, right? Well, we look at ethos, right? Ethos, that's how, I'm hitting the wrong key there. All right, okay. We look for ethos, and we know ethos means intelligence and goodwill. So in order for me to believe this testimony, I should see evidence that this person actually knows what they're talking about, and I want at least some reason to believe that they're an honest person whose testimony can be taken at face value. And look what I've got here. Okay, I've got some of the things that I look for, okay? Yeah, I've got this clear sense that he participated. Not that he heard about it later, but that he participated in it, okay? And I'm looking for some of the things that I like to see in my witness testimony. I'm looking for those kind of details that show me, right, that this person was actually probably there, right? They're giving me a sense that they were there by giving me kind of factual information that I could potentially reasonably go out and verify. He's describing events, right, that I have every reason to believe he witnessed. And then he's giving me his conclusion based on his experience. Okay. So it's reasonable to ask, right? Is this a reasonable amount of testimony? This is, after all, only one guy. Well, also remember that it's only a couple of hundred words, right? Okay, we can't have 37, 47, 57, a million cases, right, putting out here in front of us. We only have a little bit of space to work in, about 30 lines. Okay, great. But, all right, there is evidence here that Erickson says, hey, this is just one example. There are more. Okay, and of course there's this other example of this general who complained. So we're starting to get a picture that there is a body of evidence out there that supports this, that there are other witnesses who we could call upon if this is not a sufficient number for us. So our question is, right, really, is this enough to us? And that is a question that you really decide on your own as an argument evaluator, right? Okay, but I also don't want to overlook these ideas of goodwill. Now, goodwill is something that's a little bit harder to measure, but I do think there are certain things that give us a good indication of this, right? Okay, we're being told that he's a confessing church pastor, right? It's reasonable to believe that if he was a pastor, he would have insights not just into what people in the churches would have thought, right? But also that he can be presumptively, reasonably, we can expect him not to be an openly dishonest guy, at the very least, okay? Also, we should point out, right, that there's a consistency between the reports, right? Other things that we know about the situation. We knew about Hitler's anti-Semitism, right, before he became Chancellor of Germany. So did everybody else, right? And then he went out and did anti-Semitic things, right? He said he hated the Poles, and then he went out and treated the Poles like people that he hated. Okay, so there's a consistency here. And all of this makes me think that this is probably a believable witness, but whether or not you think he's believable, again, that's entirely going to be up to you to make the argument, right? So the question we're asking here about our minor premise 1, is there enough, or did they know about the atrocities? It's up to you to say, is there enough evidence here for you to accept that claim? Now, what I don't want you to be doing is saying to yourself, well, it's got to be 100%. If I'm not convinced beyond any reasonable doubt, if there's a... Well, no. What you're looking for here is what's called a prima facie case, right? That is to say, on first look, is it a reasonable opening argument? Not can it be argued against, not can it be attacked, not can it be picked apart, not can it be undermined. Because, of course, all arguments could be, if you're willing to go after them hard enough, right? The idea here is not that it is a perfect argument without gaps or flaws, but is it a reasonable case? On its face, is there ground to accept that the claim being made is probably true, right? Subject to all kinds of qualifications that we make. That's what we're looking for here. Not the perfect argument, but a prima facie case. So, here we go. We've got premise number 1. We've got premise number 1. Maybe it's a prima facie case. Maybe it's not. That's kind of up to you. But we got to look at premise 2, right? And this one doesn't have a lot of evidence. In fact, actually, I would say that what this argument does and what Erickson's doing here is Erickson is assuming that you're willing to grant him this. He's asserting it. Now, that could be because this is just, after all, a fragment of an overall book, right? Okay, that this is a fragment of a book, not the entire thing. So maybe he provides that argument elsewhere. Maybe he doesn't provide that argument at all. I don't really know at this point, because I don't have that information in front of me. What I know is that he presents it as though it is a fact, right? So maybe for me, I might call that a weakness in his argument. I might say, yeah, subject to any evidence, this is a sound argument, but that there's no evidence to back those claims yet. And then I would need to see that evidence before I would say that this is actually a sound argument fully established. It's sound in its structure, but evidentiary support for the claims isn't there for me to accept it on its face. right? So because of that, right, I can argue that maybe this argument has strong in some places, that I think that the testimonial evidence is strong, or at least hints at it's being very strong, but the evidentiary support for the second claim isn't particularly well established here, right? Okay, so we have a lot of things that we can go at and look, but I want you to see what we can do here and how we break that down. How we use what we know about structures, how we use what we know about arguments, the difference between arguments and assertions, the difference between expertise and authority and testimony, the difference between a hypothetical, a disjunctive, and a categorical syllogism. We use those to break the arguments down, and then we use that argument to take the next step to determine whether or not it's actually a strong argument, right? Okay, because if you break it down, see, now I've got this hypothetical syllogism, I've got my bifurcated premises, I've got my conclusion that goes up there, I have, right, okay, what looks like a sound conclusion if you accept all of those premises as being true. So there we go. And remember, last thing, okay, evaluation's not about nitpicking about all the ways the argument could be wrong, right? Okay, in most cases, you're going to be dealing with just a fragment, just a small piece of an argument, not the entire thing in its entire, not the entire thing from beginning to end. So evaluate the argument in that sense, and remember, the idea is to show me how well you get arguments, to show me how well you can apply standards of criteria, right? Not that you can go after and just rip something apart because it offends you on some level, right? So, okay. All right. Always ask yourself, are the assumptions reasonable assumptions? Would a reasonable person take that for granted, right? Ask whether or not the facts are well supported, and if so, how are they supported? And ask about the logic or the reasoning. If the facts are true, then is the conclusion a reasonable one to come to? And I think that's really where you want to put your emphasis, right? Are the assumptions reasonable? Are the facts well supported? And does the logic follow from the facts? If you answer all three of those questions at some point, then you're doing a good job of evaluating arguments. And that leads us to our third kind of question, an engagement question, right? The idea here is not just to describe and not merely to evaluate, but to actually participate in the argument here. And this argument is an argument rooted in the public sphere, right? That is to say, this is something that people on the street are discussing. It is something that is in the newspapers, it is on the TV, that it is talked about on the radio, that people know about it, right? Okay, now, if you live under a rock, if you don't watch the news ever, if you don't read the newspaper, if you don't follow anything that's going on, then yeah, that's kind of an issue, right? But that's kind of where the arguments are situated. That's generally how we approach things like this. But okay, how the argument is situated is also not super relevant, right? Because you're not expected to know all the facts. You're not expected to cite sources. You're expected to look at two arguments, and using what you know about arguments, you're expected to take a position in that argument. Some of you in your answers did really well and demonstrated a high level of knowledge about the issues. You knew a lot of things about what was going on with regulations and travel prohibitions, etc. Really nuanced knowledge. It was great. Some of you didn't seem that you knew very much about it at all, but you still were able to dissect the arguments and pull them apart in a way that demonstrated your understanding. So there's certain things that may be helpful or valuable to you, but the only thing that's essential to know is what arguments are, how arguments work, and then what's on the page there in front of you, right? Okay, you are going to benefit from a basic understanding of the issues. And one thing that can really, really, really benefit most of you is if you take an effort to qualify your assertions a little bit more, right? To suggest that maybe you don't have all of the facts, but this is what you think is true, and if that's true, then, right, okay, qualify your arguments a little bit more rather than making broad sweeping claims. That got a few of you into some trouble in terms of the arguments that you made. But in this case, you have two arguments. They are roughly the same number of words. They are roughly the same number of lines, although one of them has more paragraph breaks, so it looks longer. They are approximately equal in terms of their length. They both lay out arguments that develop a very small snippet of much larger issues, right? So these are not the only issues that are involved in these discussions, but these are two issues that are really kind of focused on. right? So when I read the first one, okay, I'm reading it, I get the idea that it's about the travel ban. Good, right? The travel ban is good. This is in favor of it, okay? Although what it seems like really to me is that this guy's less arguing that the travel ban is good and more along the lines of arguing that they don't think the travel ban is bad, right? There's not a lot of defense of it saying that it is necessary. There's an argument here saying basically that it is not illegal. So there you go, right? And how does the author support that argument? How does Valenta support their claim? Well, what Valenta says is that because similar actions have been taken before, because things like this have been done already, then and those actions were legal, well, then this action must be legal, right? Okay. Trump's travel ban is nowhere near as expansive as FDR's internment of the Japanese. That was, even if you think it was wrong, it was legal, and the Korematsu decision affirmed that. So, okay, all right, there we go. Trump's ban is not illegal. It's not illegal because it is like or even less of a concern than other similar kinds of actions. And if those actions were legal, this action is legal. Okay, there's, I think, a nice, concise interpretation of Valenta's argument. Arcadis's argument is that the ban is not legal, and it's not legal because it discriminates against Muslims, right? Okay, the assumption being, okay, that it's illegal to discriminate against Muslims. I believe he says unconstitutional rather than illegal, but where we have the gist. And he also seems to be making the claim that this is not about safety or security, because if it was about safety or security, then it would ban other countries like Saudi Arabia, right? If Saudi Arabia isn't banned, then it's not really about safety and security. And that if you're genuinely concerned about safety and security generally, you wouldn't focus on a minor problem like ISIS, you'd focus on a major problem like guns in the United States. Okay, there we go. So now I have a general gist of the two sides. One of them is pro-travel ban, or at least not anti-travel ban, and the other one is anti-travel ban. Definitely, I think, a little bit more than just not pro, but actually against it. Okay, great. So now what I need to do is I need to jump into this, right? So I'm going to start by asking myself, okay, which of these arguments is the stronger of them? Which is the better argument, right? And I'm going to ask myself, what are the issues? What are the issues in this argument? And both of the issues seem to be, and I believe that there are two of them, the first issue that seems to be in contention is whether or not the ban keeps people safe. And the second issue that seems to be in contention is whether or not the ban is legal, okay? And these are two separate questions. Is the ban safe, and is the ban legal? And that is how I would set up, I think, a compound coordinate argument, right? Okay, that I would have to prove both of these things, right, to say that the ban is good, and if even one of them isn't there, then we would say the ban is bad, right? So, if I'm going to jump into this argument now, I need to take a clear stand on this issue, okay? Some of you got lower scores than maybe you think you deserved on this, in part because I got a kind of, here's what one side said, here's what the other side said, the end. That's not going to cut it. Engagement means participating. Engagement means jumping in. Engagement means being part of that conversation and taking a stand on the issue, right? So you need to somewhere be saying in there either I'm for it or I'm against it, and I'm going to be looking for that when I go through and evaluate the answers, right? Okay? So, if the ban is legal and if the ban is necessary, then the ban is good. There you go. That's a claim that I'm going to make. So see what I did there, all right? I looked at the two claims, right? I looked at the two things that I felt like I needed to prove, and I set them up in the form of a hypothetical syllogism. And if it's a hypothetical syllogism, I know what I need to prove next, right? I need to prove both of those things are true, so I start by proving that it's necessary, okay? All right, and hey, you know what? I think it's reasonably affirming to say that there is a threat from ISIS. Now, a lot of you here went kind of a little bit hog wild on the support, okay? You know, a lot of like claims being made about, you know, most serious threat and super dangerous. I don't need that, okay? Don't make claims that you don't need to make in order to support your argument. Okay, the fact of the matter is I think that one could argue that Arcadis is operating on a kind of fallacy here, right? That we either talk about gun control or we talk about ISIS, and that talking about about one means not talking about the other. I think that that's actually a false dichotomy. I don't think that's a fair argument. I think that that's actually an irrelevant argument. Ignorantio elenchi, I think it's a fallacy of irrelevant information. I think that we can generally agree that there is an organization called ISIS, that they are reasonably bad people, that we have reason to be concerned about them, and that's all I need to prove that it's necessary. Right? Okay, they are a concern, and if they are a concern, then it's reasonable to take actions. So now the question is are these actions reasonable actions to take in response to that threat? Are they legal actions to take? Are they things that can be done? If there's a need for it, and if we can do it, then I would argue that it's a good thing to do. And so there we go. I look at a similar case. I say if it was legal in case A, then it must also be legal in case B. And there I've met the two standards, right? But I'm not done. I'm not done. Remember, I don't just confirm. I also need to refute. That means I need to talk with Arcadis here and address some of his concerns, right? Because Arcadis does make a concern here. You can't ignore the fact that we banned 7 countries, but we left a whole bunch of others that seem to fit that same ISIS criteria, that same ISIS concern. They seem to meet that, but we're not banning them, okay? Well, what I would say in response to Arcadis is I would say your criticism of the argument is not that the ban is bad, but that we need more ban, right? That the ban is in fact so good we need more of it, right? Okay, and in fact the only weakness of the ban is that the ban doesn't go as far as it really should have. And I would say that's actually an argument which supports the ban, not an argument which refutes its necessity. So see what I did there. I established premise 1, I established premise 2, these are my confirmation. Then I went out and I looked at what Arcadis said. I took what I thought was a really compelling argument. I thought his strongest point, and I did what I could to actually refute that argument. And that is how we set up an argument. That's how we participate in the argument, is by showing that we understand arguments, and we also are willing to engage with people on their level, right? So again, I could go the other way. I could say I don't support the ban, right? If the ban is legal and the ban is necessary, then the ban is good. Now, okay, if I'm arguing the other side here, if I'm saying, right, the ban is not legal or the ban is not necessary, then the ban is bad. And notice this is a slightly different standard here, right? Okay, I'm asserting here in this side that I don't have to prove both, I only have to prove one. And that's the difference between a compound coordinate argument and a compound subordinate argument. Right? Okay, in this case, these are like legs of a stool. These are like legs of a stool, and if I knock out one, then the whole thing comes tumbling down. So, there we go, okay? I'm going to argue that it is, in fact, not legal because it's discriminatory. And if it's discriminatory, then it's bad, right? Okay, because discrimination is illegal. But I could also go through here and do other kind of interesting things, too. Like, this is an example of what I might consider to be a for argument. Because what I'm doing here is I'm constructing a really interesting approach, right? Okay, I'm combining a disjunctive syllogism and a hypothetical syllogism and a fact claim, right, in order to come to a conclusion that this ban isn't necessary because it's not about safety and it's not legal because it's not about protecting the United States at all. It's an unnecessary restriction, right? I think that's a really... So remember, there's two things that you always want to be working on when you're evaluating or when you're engaging, in arguments. The first of them is we're going to be looking for charity, right? That is, we treat our opponents as though they're reasonable human beings who just happen to be wrong. And the other thing is that we're objective. That is to say that we hold opposing sides to the same standards. What's sauce for the goose has to be sauce for the gander, right? That is to say, if we say that one side is being held to a measuring stick, we have to hold the other side to that same measuring stick and hold them to the same level of accountability, right? So, for example, I found it actually really interesting how many people actually thought Jim Arcadis' argument was really harsh, and they called him harsh for making it. I actually went back and read it, and I thought that was really very interesting. Of course, harsh is not really an argumentative concept. Are you saying that you thought that he was unnecessarily uncharitable towards the ban itself? Because that would be interesting, right? Okay, if his argument is not charitable, if it's assuming motives rather than proving motives, if it's treating people as though they're not reasonable human beings without any evidence for doing so, well, okay, then make that part of the argument. I think you can say that as part of your evaluation. But when it comes down to it, his harshness, his tone doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not he's making a sound argument. And we can talk about the ethics of argument. We know that, right? That's something that we've talked about already. We know about the ethics of argument, so we can make that claim. But about what side you're going to pick, now you're going to have to make a reason for that, right? Okay. The same thing is true, right? Okay, if we're going to talk about making claims. And there was actually, again, very interesting. There were a number of students who would say, and this actually is both sides, right? Okay, they would say, well, I support Valenta's argument because Valenta is objective and unbiased, right? But Arcadis' argument, there's his name, Jim Arcadis' argument, well, he was biased. Or the other side, right? I support Jim Arcadis' argument because his argument was all based on facts, but Jerry Valenta's argument was all based on opinions. Well, okay, well now if that's true, right, if one side is using facts and the other side is using just opinions, if one side is biased and the other side is objective, well that's really good reason. So you need to show us that, right? You can't just say one side uses fact and the other side uses opinions. Give me an example of the fact. Give me an example of the opinion. Show me that, right? Because it's really interesting that there was very rarely any follow-up after that gave me any reason to believe that. And I also think it's really super interesting that it happened on both sides, right? That no matter what side you picked, it was just this idea that my side must be accurate because it's the one I believe and the other side must be wrong, right? Okay, and that really is what that's expression, right? Like I read it and I thought this was good because I believed it, and I thought the other side was wrong because that's not the side of the issue that I'm on. That is casuistry by definition, right? That's picking the side of the argument and saying this is a good argument because it's the one that I believe already, and not this is a bad argument because I don't want to believe that, right? That's casuistry. It starts from a place of feeling and emotion and then tries to layer logic over the top of it to make sense of it. Engaging with arguments means that we're not just engaging in pro-argument, that's arguments for our side. It means we're also engaging in contra-argument. That is, we're engaging with our opponents on some level, engaging with them reasonably about why we believe their arguments aren't as strong as our arguments. But most importantly, when you're engaging with arguments, you need to be showing me that you understand arguments. We need to see the structure of your arguments. If I'm looking at your argument and I can look at it and say, oh, look, they're using an example of a hypothetical syllogism right here. This argument is structured around, oh, this person clearly understands the difference between testimony and expertise. Look how they set up their own personal eyewitness account of this phenomenon as a way of backing up their story, right? Okay, that shows me that you're applying what you learned. And engagement really is kind of the highest level sort of argumentative literacy, is the ability to participate in that argumentative sphere. So, couple things to be careful of, all right? Qualify your assertions. If you're not sure, say you're not sure. There's a difference between saying, I've done a lot of reading, I believe that ISIS really is a threat, and therefore we really need to do something about it, okay? And saying, only an idiot doesn't think that ISIS is a threat, right? Okay, now that is the difference between a charitable response, one that qualifies your approach, right, and one that assumes that you couldn't possibly be wrong, a kind of narcissistic approach to the making of arguments. So be really careful of that. And there are a couple of examples, right? I mean, this is not to pick on any student in particular because this is not anything that was out of the ordinary. But in this case, right, you have this idea that I am so certain that I am correct in this. I'm so certain that I'm right, that the person who says something opposing to me is actually offensive to me. You're pretty convinced that you're right, okay? And really, click, 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 2 seconds on Google, and this particular person turned out to actually be wrong. That the claim that Valenta made, Jim Arcadis made was actually true, at least factually accurate, and the idea that it was not true and offensively not true. And see the difference between, gotta go back up here, The difference that we're looking for here is one of this tone, right? This tone is indicative of a lack of charity, which really does undermine the grade that you're going to get, or the score, excuse me, that you're going to get on this particular type of an exam. And then what we're looking for in terms of argumentative literacy, the idea of, I've never heard this information, I don't believe this information is factually accurate. Assuming that it is not factually accurate, of course, this argument is a really bad one. You can also talk about how it brings in irrelevant information. The two things don't necessarily have anything to do with one another, that this is an attempt to distort the debate. Like, there's all kinds of ways that this particular claim could have been addressed, okay, that did not overstate one's own knowledge of the case at hand, and did not then treat as just categorically unreasonable the person who disagrees with them, right? A lot of what you're working on here with engagement is you're working on thinking about things like tone, thinking about qualifying your arguments, and things like that. So I hope this really kind of gets you through and helps you kind of understand the kind of three basic things that we're looking for. Remember, we're talking about describing arguments, that is getting at their structure, identifying their claims, identifying the types of reasoning, the types of evidence, the types of claims being made, okay, evaluation, that is we're going to go one step further, we're going to apply criteria or standards, we're going to actually evaluate those arguments, and last but not least, we're talking about engaging arguments, which goes one step beyond even evaluating and starts talking about things in terms of how we're going to participate in that. We're going to bring what we know, we're going to bring what we believe into that, and we're going to kind of participate as members of the debate, right? Okay. So I hope this helped you kind of figure out a little bit about the essay exam. I want you to use this as a review when you're prepping and preparing for your final. I want you to be thinking about these things as you prepare and work on case studies through the rest of the semester.